Hello, how are you today? Welcome to part two of Race Matters Learn Why. I'm Carmen Wimberly Coffin. I'm happy to have you here with me today. So, yesterday we talked about a little bit about racism and how it has affected your town or city in terms of where black people live and how sometimes um, the uh, the city changes because of uh, the thinking that it doesn't matter what happens to the black and brown people. I want to talk a little bit today about what is racism, and then I want to talk a little bit about why Black Lives Matter in terms of education and housing. So there are definitions of race. I'm going to read them to you. Read one to you. Um, the first one dates back to the 1580s, and it's about running. Um, Race is a constructed term. Race in terms of people, and so on in my research from a book called The Invention of the White Race by Theodore Allen, um, and the Dismantling Race Project, the race is has become a thing. So there were different races of people, and in America, that became a definition of your importance in the class and economic system of America. Racism is a system of advantage uh, because of the race that you have been placed in. Most people, when they came to America, were uh, they were immigrants. The Native Americans were already here, but other people who came to America were immigrants, and they were English, they were Dutch, they were Scotch, they were Italians, they were just whatever country they came from. That's what they were. But as it became more important for people to be white, those countries' names that people were given were assimilated into the white race. You can't do that if you're brown, and so that's why we had we and still have, because some of these laws are still on the books. If you had, say in Louisiana, 1/32 of a drop of black blood in you, that made you black. It didn't matter what you looked like. It didn't matter how diluted the blood was. If you had any black blood in you, then that made you black. And so racism is the Merriam-Webster definition. I want to read it to you because I want to make sure I have it right. Is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. A lot of people don't, they say they're not racist because they don't believe that. Here's the second definition: a doctrine or a political program based on the assumption of racism and designed to execute the principles, or a political or social system founded on racism. So that fits our country because most of the systems in our country were based on the assumption that white people were superior to black. And it doesn't matter that you personally weren't part of that, but the white people who came before you, who created the systems, were part of that. That makes the system racist. So, just really briefly today, I want to talk just a minute or two about two of those systems. Um, and the first one I want to talk about is education. So, when slavery was initiated here in America, one of the laws was that it was against the law to teach slaves to read or write. So you say, how did black people learn how to read or write? Well, one of the things that I learned in my research and just in reading a book that shocked me when I opened the book and started to read it, it was a fiction book. It's called The Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd. One of the first scenes in the book is that a mother a Southern mother in Charleston is having a birthday party for her daughter, who is 10, and the gift that she gives the daughter is a slave girl who is the same age as her. She wraps a bow, ties a bow around the neck of the slave girl, and gifts this person, this 10-year-old person, to her daughter. That's her gift to her, a person. It just shocked me to read it. I knew those things happened, but just to read it, to see it, was horrifying to me. And so that so that made her a house slave. And so house slaves, especially for young children, were considered companions for the slaves. I'll put the name of the book in the chat. But they were considered companions for their owners. And so when the owners were getting taught, a lot of times the slave was sitting there because that was the companion. It was so that that child wouldn't be by themselves. So the slave could learn. I assume that they didn't think the slaves had enough brains to learn what they were teaching the owner, the other young children. So that's a way a lot of slaves learned to read and write, was because they were sitting in the presence of someone else who was being taught. The book, again, was The Invention of Wings. It's by Sue Monk Kidd. I want to read you just really briefly something. I found this in some family heirlooms. It's a book called Negro Makers of History, and it's by Carter G. Woodson. This is an old book. This is a first edition from my aunt won it in a library contest in 1937. But this book was written in 1928. It's copyrighted 1928. This is one of the things that's written in here. The ability of the Negro to learn by contact with others, even when no one makes a special effort to teach him, is unusual. Mind you, this was written in 1928. Much of what the Negro has learned has been acquired in this way. And another thing he writes about is a poet named George Horton from North Carolina. He says, to learn to read, this gentleman was born in Chatham County in 1797. To learn to read, however, he had to commit parts of the Methodist hymnal to memory, and then to match the words of it with those of a spelling book. So if there's a will, there's a way. If you want to learn how to read, you learn how to read. Those are just a couple of examples of how people learned to read. Black people learned how to read. Slaves learned how to read. And then they would surreptitiously take other slaves in with them somewhere and teach them quietly in the dark or by candlelight, teach them how to read. So it was taught. It was taught. And because slave owners, for the most part, were Christians, they didn't have a problem with there being a black preacher, there being, or they would host their own services on Sunday morning, and they would teach from the Bible. So if you were getting things out of the Bible or out of a hymnal, that was okay, because they weren't thinking that was teaching people to read and write. I want to go on past that. So for 200 years, while slavery was in place, it was against the law to teach blacks how to read and write. So for 200 years, blacks were behind what white people were getting. That was part of the law. That was written into the system. And then as slavery ended and schools were built or people taught in their homes, they would teach in a room in their homes. And when public schools were finally forced to have to provide schooling for black people, the schools would be substandard. they were built with leftovers, so they would give leftover materials for the schools to be built with. They might not get any textbooks at all. And if they got textbooks, they were the ones that were discarded by the white school system after they had been used, and to the point where they were throwing them in the trash. But rather than throw them in the trash, they would give them to the black population to use, to teach and learn from. Um, and that, the funding wasn't equally applied. And it wasn't that there wasn't funding, because the white schools would be nice. The white schools would get the good books. They would get, the teachers would get paid. Might not have been much, but they would get paid. And even as late as the 60s and the 70s, when I look and see the teachers, the black teachers from my community who were teaching, especially those when desegregation of the school system started, and the white schools would, before they brought black children in, they brought in black teachers. The superintendent of the schools would go to the black schools and ask the principals for their cream of the crop teachers, because didn't want just any black teachers to show up in the schools. They wanted the cream of the crop. So the best teachers were taken out of the black schools and went to the white schools to teach. Those teachers, for the most part, had master's degrees. White teachers didn't have to have a master's degree to teach those same things, but black teachers did. Um, so those are separate things. In fact, when my mother came from Mount Olive to Raleigh to teach, the black principal went to the town, watched her teach, and came back, but had to get permission to hire her from the county or the city school system. He couldn't just hire who he wanted like the white principals could. He had to get permission first. So there have been, and this is up into the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. So these things are baked into the system. And while things might change, all of the things don't change. If you want to learn more, you'll have to contact me. My email is racemattersforme, RACEMATTERS4ME@gmail.com. I want to talk just a little bit about housing today. Not going to go deep into anything. As you know, we were a rural society. There were some towns and cities in the country, but most people lived in the rural society. So after slavery ended, for those who moved away from the slave quarters, or even if they were told they could use what was their, they would get some property off of the plantation, and whether they purchased it, whether they were able to purchase it, obviously they didn't have any money, so they were able to work as sharecroppers. In some instances, there were free blacks already, so they had made money and were able to purchase land. But a lot of times still, even if you purchased your land, you built your home, you had to buy your supplies from the store in the area, or from the area, and that was generally owned by the slaveholder, or the previous slaveholder, and they could charge whatever they wanted to. And if you didn't have the money to pay up front, they would let you run a bill. They would be happy for you to run some credit, run a bill, and they charged what they wanted to. And the charge might be this thing today when you put it on your account, and when they tallied up at the end of the month, when you had to pay out of your profits, or the end of the season, they may have changed what they were charging you, but they didn't have to tell you that. So for most sharecroppers, they were always behind, because prices changed. The same people that they had to sell their product to were the same people who owned the company store. So the system was built to not help you get ahead. And so that's something else that had to be looked at. If you wanted to buy a house, as towns and cities grew, if you didn't have enough money to build and buy your own, and you went to the bank, banks had a process called redlining. So banks would take a map, and I'm just going to show you. This is the front of a book called The Color of Law, but this is a map of a town, and the places where it's red on the map, that's called redlining. So the map would be color coded. The map would be color coded for certain parts of town, and certain parts of town would get loans at certain percentages to those people. But the places that were redlined, loans were not offered. So if that's where black people were living, loans weren't offered there. Banks didn't have branches there. If you look in the southern part of your town today, you might not see branches of any of the banks for your city in those black neighborhoods because of redlining. It's important to know that the systems are baked in. Even if you were able to get a loan, the FHA had written exclusions into their loan process. So these areas could be excluded. If you look at some of the white neighborhoods and look at some of the covenants that were for each neighborhood, the covenants had written into them no Negroes could buy this house. No Negroes could buy in this covenant. And those covenants were carried out. They were legal. They were part of the contract that you signed when you bought or sold a home. And so those are the kinds of things that are baked into the system and have to be changed. And the other thing, I posted on my Facebook page just before I came on some pictures of South Raleigh. We have a beautiful edifice called the Memorial Auditorium, which is a theater, a hall where the symphony plays, that kind of thing. And it's gorgeous. The black part of town was right behind it. So South Raleigh, the streets were built going downhill. So the homes were built on stilts almost, brick structures that were under the homes looked like stilts at the beach. If you've got a house on the beach, you build it up over the water so that when the tide comes in or when there's bad weather, the house is not immediately underwater. Well, as these houses were built in South Raleigh, they were built on these kinds of stilt brick foundations, and you can see the street level is going down, and there was no gravel in the streets to help keep the runoff from going down. There was, it was just when there were heavy rains, the water just ran down and continued to destroy the street. Or I don't even think of it as a street. And granted, this is back in the 50s where they didn't pave streets like they pave them now, but they did put things in the street, gravel, to help keep the street from falling apart. But today in South Raleigh, there is still issues with runoff. Look in your town, look in your city, see if the places where the white people live are on higher ground than where black and brown people are living, and if there are still issues with street runoff, environmental issues that aren't dealt with. So those are just some other things that I wanted to share with you a little bit today. I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to extend this mini session through Friday. I was going to end it Thursday. Tomorrow we're going to talk about health care and economics and wealth building and how race matters in those areas. Keep a check on the news. Look at what's going on with Chase Bank today. They are talking again about redlining. And this book that I shared, it's The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It's an excellent book. It is a series of history and stories. The other book that I mentioned was The Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd. I will try to go back and add that, edit comments or edit the title and post and put those things in, as well as my email address. If I can be of service to you, if I can help you learn any more, if there are things that you want to know about, please let me know. And I'm so happy to share them with you. Thank you so much. I will see you tomorrow at 1 o'clock for Race Matters. Learn Why.